everyone. Thanks, Alex, and I'm happy to be here with y'all. And thanks, Barbara, for initiating this conversation with Kate and I so many months ago, down when we were down at the Tule River Reservation there. And so I'm happy to be with you all today, and yeah, talk to you a little bit about our organization, the Occidental Arts and Ecology Center, and we have the Water Institute, and a program or a project of the Water Institute is our Bring Back the Beaver campaign. So I put together a little slideshow for you to kind of just introduce you to kind of the essence of our campaign. And in many respects, it's a little bit of how we won, because we're kind of celebrating the fact that 20 years into this thing, we've had a major policy shift in the state I'll talk about, and some other thoughts about that. And then we'll looking forward to lots of questions and things. And so let me share screen here. All righty. Is that all the way up there?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yep, perfect.
All right. Okay. Beaver in California. So I'm trying to think about the power and nature work y'all are doing on 30 by 30 goals, and just a beautiful image here of up in, if you recognize the mountain in the back, that's Mount Lassen. So this is Child's Meadow up in that part of the world, and a whole super interesting study I'll mention in a bit there. But just quickly to say that Occidental Arts and Ecology Center is a 501c3. We're a little nonprofit in Western Sonoma County. You can kind of see in the map down there, we're sort of between Santa Rosa and Bodega Bay, south of the Russian River. And we do a whole bunch of things and work with lots of folks. And I did want to acknowledge in the upper right there that Kate Lundquist is my co-director, and she'd love to be here with you, but she was busy tonight. So, and then just kind of to start off with, I'll say that I'm a fundamentally, for the bulk of my career, I've been an endangered species vertebrate biologist, and have worked on the whole crew of vertebrates, fish and reptiles and amphibians and birds and mammals. But clearly a lot on the salmonids, and where OAC is at is in the Russian River Basin and Dutch Bill Creek, and just the whole central coast and north coast evolutionary significant unit, if you will, of coho salmon. And coho are kind of an indicator, if you will, of certainly freshwater ecosystems relative to the more active fluvial parts of them in many ways, and also the connectivity with certain uplands and wetlands and that kind of and estuarine systems as well. And the precipitous decline of coho is something that many folks, ourselves included, have been very active with for the last over 25 years now. I will say that their estimates are there was roughly 50,000 coho returning to the Russian River in the 1950s. And by 2000, we had as few as possibly 5 fish. And that really kicked a lot in. And so what that did for me is really started looking at thinking about what we were up against and just a broader sense of that question. And if folks haven't read this wonderful book by Freeman House, the late Freeman House, about the work of the Mattole watershed in Humboldt County, this idea of totem salmon. But I really love this quote, that the first thing we learned from salmon was the importance of the watershed as a unit of perception. And as a community organizer, and what OAC is really a movement organizing space, I think a lot about that unit of perception, and think not just about watersheds as unit of perceptions, but really this one here. And this one here, as far as I can tell, is really the ultimate headwaters that's in need of ecosystem restoration. So how do we restore the ecosystem and reconnect people to, say, the importance of freshwater habitat and ecosystems in California, and how critical they are, and everything else? And so I literally have water on the brain, and I'm spent a lot of time trying to work on how to mitigate what I call cerebral imperviousness, if you will, so we can infiltrate that water and get that going. So to the topic of today, this our OAC Bring Back the Beaver campaign. We kind of started pushing on this, to be honest with you, in the late 90s, early 2000s, but in earnest was really 2012-ish. 2009, 2012 is when we really got going with it. And we're focused on things like today, education and outreach. We also support a lot on citizen science, research and demonstration, and policy change. So talk about some of that. We are talking about the North American beaver, Castor canadensis. There are two extant beavers on planet water right now. There's Castor fiber, the Eurasian beaver, and then there's Castor canadensis, or North American beaver. All the existing beavers are native to the northern hemisphere. There are no native beavers in the southern hemisphere, although there are introduced beavers in parts of, like a lot of folks hear about the beavers down in Tierra del Fuego, but those were escapees from a fur farm, tragically enough. And then just acknowledging, and we work a lot with a number of indigenous communities and have some of our peer-reviewed papers have spent a lot of time trying to really understand the ethnography or ethnozoology, if you will, of traditional ecological knowledge in beaver. And we found a word for beaver in over 60 California native languages at this point. So that's super fun. Here's some of the ones more local to where we are in Sonoma, Mendocino area. And so a lot of the work we try to do is really have a both science-based and accessible outreach and target our audiences as well. And that can be all kinds of folks from agencies and restoration communities. We have been really emphasizing working in the coastal salmonids and Central Valley salmonids to Bay Delta to some degree, and Sacramento, San Joaquin, and then the foothill communities and mountain meadows and the riparian rangelands, because we think that there's a beaver nexus in many of the issues that folks are addressing in those areas where beaver could be helpful as a partner at times when appropriately engaged with. And that little quote there, the fight incision with incisors, is one of the things we're often trying to deal with, is how do we, in our coastal areas, especially in our mountain meadows, as we're dealing with the legacy of land use that impacted the deranged or has deranged hydrology and often resulted in channels that are incised or entrenched and are dewatering and dehydrating landscapes. And it's one of the cool things that beavers tend to do in river systems, freshwater systems, is upgrade these systems and hold water on the land. And so we want to fight that incision with those incisors. Those beaver teeth are pretty fun, right? That orange color is the staining of the iron that they get primarily from bark and trees like willows. And those pesky teeth can grow up to 4 feet in 1 year. So beaver are always having to self-sharpen and reduce the height, if you will, of those biface chisels on their front of their mouth. They're quite the critter. Again, for me as a biologist, as a wildlife biologist, restoration ecologist, I would say I probably, since I was a kid growing up around the Tetons, Yellowstone in Idaho, or fishing bass ponds in Maryland, that the nexus between where there were beavers and beaver habitat and beaver ponds and beaver canals, the presence of a plethora of other life forms was always what drew me to them. And so for me, beaver's always just been, before I maybe more professionally got engaged in beaver, they were always just a kindred spirit, because I like lots of other critters. In California and in the West, it's certainly worth noting that there's some pretty tight correlations with certain species and the presence or absence of beaver. And so lots of literature on the various salmonids, such as that coho salmon, the upper right, western pond turtle, the southwestern pond turtle, which I know is being petitioned right now. The Cascades frog down in the center, Columbia spotted frog, sage grouse, that's a willow flycatcher on the lower right. These are a bunch of species where we've really worked with those biologists who were not saying you need to become an unbridled beaver believer per se, but recognizing beaver as a keystone species that creates conditions conducive for your critter is at least worth working and engaging on supporting beaver and acknowledging them, which wasn't happening a decade ago, in all honesty, in many of these communities. Certainly the salmonids have gotten a lot of attention, and deservedly so, and the nexus with beaver. I'd say the work of Dr. Michael Pollack, especially, and others up in Washington and Oregon working in coastal salmonid communities, and especially on coho salmon, and really getting into the complexity of the kinds of habitat that beaver create. And just like this image of that is Michael Pollock's of looking at a beaver dam and the associated impoundment above that and the different ways in which water's spilling over it and the depth of the pool below and the hyperrheic connectivity and cold water upwelling and these floodplain reconnections and groundwater recharge and irrigation of increased wetted widths and riparian habitat are all things that are well documented in the literature that beaver do, and which is good for freshwater ecosystems. Interestingly enough, dams aren't the whole story, if you will. And this is a really interesting paper, a report, if you will, done by Marissa Parrish and Justin Garwood, looking at the Smith River. So if you're up in Del Norte County, up in the Smith, this is a big river system, way too big and deep for beavers to put channel spanning dams on. So they're wholly bank burrowing beavers. And so in the image below underwater, in the kind of center, you can see the entrance to a bank burrow. And then that big pile of sticks on the left is the leftover refuse after the beavers have chewed off the cambium. And what they found is that in the bank burrows themselves and in the actual piles of sticks outside of that along the river edge, they coined this whole idea that they're calling river reefs. And they documented just a myriad of native species in the Smith River system utilizing these bank lodges and these river reefs. And so even the heterogeneity and the complexity of the habitat beaver are creating in these large main stem rivers without dams is also not to be underestimated, I would say. One of the things that a lot of folks are really interested in beavers these days is the nexus of our global weirding and the extremities in our hydrologic patterns these days, whether it's drought to deluge or the fire nexus or not. And so these beaver wetted areas in flooded situations are really functioning like speed bumps to attenuate peak hydrographs and spread water out and reduce impact to flooding. And there's a bunch of literature on that. And then the image in the middle right there is Dr. Joe Wheaton took this photo up in Idaho a couple of years ago. And then Dr. Emily Fairfax published her paper called Smokey the Beaver. And it's really looking at these amazing remnant unburned areas in these riparian zones of these massive fires that retain their vegetation and their water and become critical refugia for wildlife to seek both safety during the fire event and also to have cover and food, afterwards and such. And so that's a whole interesting piece of the puzzle of Smokey the Beaver. And then they're in the realms of water quantity. Again, there's the flood attenuation for high flows. There's the retention of water in low flows. There's the nexus with groundwater recharge, the connectivity through the hyperrheic flow. And in the arid mountain west, where especially in our Mediterranean climates with our short winters and our long dry seasons, anything that helps keep more water on the land longer for everybody is really often thought to be really important. And so this is something that, again, beaver aren't a silver bullet, and not everywhere they're interacting is doing all of these things simultaneously. And so it's not to say they're doing everything all the time, but there are plenty of examples and observations and case studies of all of these things happening and in California and throughout. Another one has to do with basically the Clean Water Act and water quality, and not just the dams themselves and how the dam functions, but the actual impounded water behind the dam and also the associated wetlands that build up, especially the sediment that they tend to trap and the depositional features of that system, improving water quality, the wetlands that then grow into that system that then are engaged with the reutilization, trapping, if you will, or reusing of various nutrients, especially a lot around phosphorus and nitrogen, things like that, fecal coliforms. There was a wonderful study done back in 2007 by Sarah Muskoff in Taylor Creek, which is near South Lake Tahoe. It's a drainage to South Lake Tahoe. It has a wonderful beaver habitat in it. And based on her study, she documented that, in fact, the presence of the beaver dams and ponds significantly reduced phosphorus delivery to Lake Tahoe. So while we're all on the idea of keeping Tahoe blue. We kind of think that beavers are helping keep Tahoe blue and ought to be acknowledged for that. Kate and I recently did a talk at the State of the Beaver Conference up in Canyonville, Oregon recently. It's a big national, in fact, it was international beaver conference. And this woman, Katie Holzer, who works for the city of Gresham, Oregon, did a beautiful talk. This is the title of her talk. But I cherry picked these two graphs that she put out with some data from these urban beavers they're managing. And one on the left is there was a big stormwater ponded system that had been highly engineered, and they were trying to move the water around to mitigate 40 acres of industrial impervious surface, asphalt, industrial roofs and things before it discharged into the creek. And the beavers moved into that system, totally rearranged it and messed with it. And the engineers were freaking out because their perfect design had been manipulated, but they decided to roll with it. They had data before beavers and after beavers. And so you can basically look at the percent of pollutant removal, so the vertical axis going up and down of percent pollutant removal, and then the associated various pollutants there, and brown with no beaver dams, red with beaver dams. And pretty much you can get a sense that just look at the significance across the board with every one of those pollutants. The ability of the beaver, the associated ponds and dams and wetlands to remove those various pollutants. And then also they did a big study on water temperature and stream temperature, which we know is really important, especially as we lose cooler water in many areas, and that impacts our salmonids, who are cold water dependent fish. And looking at human-made ponds and beaver ponds and the change in the maximum stream temperature downstream of the dam, and also the number of days where the temperatures were in exceedance of their TMDL. And in fact, what you can see is that downstream human dams were much hotter, 2.5 degrees Celsius on average, whereas the beaver dams were across the board cooler water. And then also they weren't having any temperature exceedances below them. And so I think it's the power in nature, if you will, of these emergent properties, that what beavers are doing, the kinds of habitat they're creating, have a multiplicity of benefits. Although not everybody agrees. And so, working with beavers, you feel like sometimes you're damned if you do and damned if you don't. But what that really allowed us with our campaign is to spend a lot of time, working on identifying and resolving, first of all, historic and cultural, social, informational barriers about beaver. It's, for the most part, and the California Department of Fish and Wildlife, as recently as less than a decade ago, pretty much was of the mind that while beaver were known to be native to a small area within California, small areas. In fact, if you look at that map in the center, I don't know if my cursor is hot here, this upper Shasta Klamath zone, Modoc, the Sacramento Delta, San Joaquin, and just down there in the Colorado is where it was asserted in the 1930s and 40s that beaver were native at time of contact. A group of us got together and published these two peer-reviewed papers looking at the historic range of beaver in the Sierra Nevada, and this other one for the coastal California. And including the hatched areas from the 1930s and 40s, we added in all of this other area based on our interpretation of the various results of things that we found in our papers from historic evidence and newspaper articles and interviews and reading trappers' journals and ethnographic evidence and actually some archaeofaunal evidence and such. And so, but it is complicated because the Division of Wildlife actually translocated 1,221 beavers from the late 1920s up until 1950. In fact, this parachuting beaver poster is a 1950 image in El Dorado National Forest. But even the Division of Wildlife at that time, the reason they were doing this is because they asserted that beaver dams in the mountains saved water for fish, wildlife, and agriculture. And that's what they thought about in the 1950s until post-World War II. And it's literally only now 70 years later that we're reclaiming a connection with beavers as a partner in these systems versus a nuisance that needs to be primarily lethally managed, to be honest with you. If you're going to have a campaign about a species, it's great to have an author who's a really good writer, write an award-winning book and have a chapter about your project. So if you haven't read this book, Eager, or listened to it, if you listen to books on tape, the whole book is great. Chapter 6, California Streaming, we obviously are especially fond of. We're also been really encouraging in the world of citizen science. And in fact, the Department of Fish and Wildlife, nobody actually really has a solid demographic or population distribution of where beavers are in California. And so we've really been promoting and encouraging folks over the years to use iNaturalist as a citizen science platform. I mean, it's got its issues, but nonetheless, it's currently the best thing we've got. And so by all means, use that to document your evidence and that kind of stuff. And then what I was mentioning earlier, Kate and I spent a lot of time in the early 2000s. Like the first thing we heard was beaver are not native and they're a nuisance. And so that was the historic ecology work. And then we heard from the salmon community that beaver are bad for salmon and they block fish passage. Even though there's a wonderful saying in the Pacific Northwest that beaver taught salmon how to jump, and beaver have been on the landscape for 5 million years. Nonetheless, we had to take that issue on. And so we really started working primarily through the Salmonid Restoration Federation, and then also up in the mountain meadows of the Sierra Nevada and the Southern Cascades, we engaged with the Sierra Meadows Partnership. And then we've been working with flood control agencies. And so a lot of it is just engaging with communities of folks that are clearly, they love their salmon and they love their mountain meadows, and finding ways to recognize and engage with collaboratively, in addition to everything else that's being done to restore these systems, which is myriad and huge, can beaver become a part of that portfolio, if you will. One of the land user groups, if you will, that has a significant overlap with beaver habitat is the rangeland ranching communities and folks that riparian rangeland systems especially. And there's a long history of many ranchers not being so happy with beaver and having a perception that beaver steal their water. And that's been changing throughout the arid Mountain West. And we have some really amazing case studies in Utah and Idaho and Eastern Oregon and Nevada. For instance, John Griggs here, the ranch manager at Maggie Creek Ranch up near Elko, he's a wonderful spokesperson right now and basically says that, 20 years ago, they shot beaver like they were vermin. And now if they didn't have beaver on the ranch, their ranch would be dry and during the drought and they'd be out of business. And basically other ranchers are saying similar things. And so we worked with the Marin Resource Conservation District to bring John Griggs, Betsy Stapleton, and Tracy Shore together. And they did a ranching and beaver panel, which that link there, you can find it on YouTube. And then if you haven't seen the film, Creating Miracles in the Desert, this is about the work around Maggie Creek and Dixie Creek, Susie Creek, Carlin, Elko, Nevada, and the return of beavers, and through just a change in grazing regimes to move the cows off, reduce pressure during the hot season of cows on the vegetation and allow the beavers to come back. And it's a super inspiring 30-year study that I think, talk about freshwater recovery, it's amazing. Again, I mentioned some of the other wildlife biologists. And so we early on started working with folks at Point Blue and the Institute for Bird Populations who are studying willow flycatcher in the Sierras and the significant decline in those species, and prompting them to really look into their data and start actually tracking and correlating the presence of beaver modified habitat with where they were finding willow flycatchers. And they, in the end, found some amazing, very positive correlations and published this one paper. Song sparrow showed up as highly correlated as well. And then also the very first slide I started with had Child's Meadow up in the Lassen area. And a number of folks through UC Davis and other Nature Conservancy, Point Blue, got a bunch of funding from California Department of Fish and Wildlife and are looking at carbon sequestration and biodiversity benefits of beaver and beaver dam analogs in Child's Meadow. And that's a super interesting study from 2020. And so at some point when we think about what we call beaver restoration. This is really a multifaceted suite of approaches, our holistic approach with a variety of actions. So the first one is just coexist. If you got beaver, then figure out how to live with the beaver you got and coexist with those beaver. And if they're doing things that you don't like, I'm going to show you some images of some non-lethal coexistence strategies. You can work on enhancing that beaver habitat. That may be planting more food, or fencing out areas, or obviously reducing, say, stop lethally trapping beavers, allowing them to expand within the watershed, again through enhancing areas that are currently not functional habitat. So through riparian freshwater wetland habitat restoration, you can enhance those areas to allow them to expand. In some cases, we do beaver mimicry in areas where it probably will never be beaver habitat. It wasn't beaver habitat, but we can act like beavers, if you will. And then ultimately, there is this whole question about relocation or translocation and bringing beaver back. And I can mention a little bit of what's happening there. So these are some images of different kinds of coexistence devices for people who have beaver dams that are flooding out their property and inundating areas that they don't want, or beavers are plugging up their waterway conveyance structures, like the beaver backsaver in the middle photo, which is an issue with these 2-track weirs, the cement weirs that many rice growers, duck club managers, wetland managers in the Central Valley use to convey water between ponds and sloughs and channels. And the beavers love to plug them up. And this simple device that you can just add on is, so far, we're a year and a half in on several installations, is 100% effective. They went from 6 hours a week managing these systems and literally pulling their lower backs and getting a workers' comp claim to not having to touch these systems. So lots of opportunity there. Here's a wonderful project near Lincoln, California, in the lower flat elevation of the valley on the eastern side a little bit. And the red hatched area was the original single threaded channel, not the original channel, but the channel as it had been levied off between the red hatched arrows and maintained as a single threaded channel. And the Placer Land Trust was keeping it that way. And then they partnered with U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, who said, we'll only work with you if you stop killing the beavers, which the Land Trust had been doing. And then they knocked out certain sections of the levee, and then they reinforced the beaver dams in a few places with some posts, and they allowed the beavers to be. And within a 3-year period, the wetted area of that zone increased by over 1,200%. It's actually now about 1,800% increase for about $60,000 worth of initial investment. And it's just a palooza of wildlife in there. It's amazing. And then we work a lot with indigenous tribes and folks, and the Tule River tribe we're working with significantly. We're also working with the Mountain Maidu peoples up near Chester in their beautiful valley called Tasman Koyom. We're doing a lot of process-based restoration, beaver mimicry, limbing and thinning forest fuel loads, and then integrating those into channels to retain water and hold water in preparation for the return of beaver. And the OAC co-founded with a whole bunch of other folks, a brand new group called the California Process-Based Restoration Network, or CalPBR Network. And this was our Build Like a Beaver training we just had last month with 75 folks. We built like 70 structures in this area and reconnected 1.5 miles worth of channel in this mountain meadow. And then we work a lot on policy stuff. And so integrating beaver language into coho recovery plans or the state wildlife action plans, building coalitions, building momentum. During the process of comments for the California Natural and Working Lands Climate Smart Strategy, we got a number of folks to join us in a letter to Secretary Crowfoot about the inclusion of beaver as a nature-based solution, if you will. And yep, we hired a lobbyist. And I would say the last couple of years to move policy forward in Sacramento, hiring Jennifer Fearing, a fearless advocate, it was one of the best things we've ever done, for sure. And so that's a lot, because ultimately we've really engaged in assessing and changing policy. And so there's been a lot of work around not just outlawing the trapping of beaver, but all fur bears, which that actually happened. OAC wasn't part of that Wildlife Protection Act in 2019, but it did benefit those of us working on beaver. And then we also petitioned the Fish and Game Commission to have CDFW issue some depredation guidance, which in fact they did this past June 2023. And it's basically moving from a lethal perception to a coexistence, non-lethal set of strategies with how it is we coexist with beaver. And so kind of like Sisyphus the beaver pushing that rock up the hill, persistence pays off and change is possible. And so through relationships and ripeness and a few retirements and a lot of resources, this past June, Governor Newsom actually put in the budget and the legislature passed it to create a brand new, not this past June of 2022, a year and a half-ish ago, a new California Department of Fish and Wildlife led beaver restoration program. And I love this quote by Gavin Newsom here that says, to be successful in our efforts to protect biodiversity, the department must take a proactive leap towards bringing back beavers onto the landscape through a concerted effort to combine prioritize restoration projects, partnerships, local, federal, state agencies, tribes, and update these policies of practice, support beaver management and conservation throughout the state. Beavers are an untapped, creative, climate-solving hero that helps prevent the loss of biodiversity facing California. And I would say the loss of freshwater habitat, which supports so much biodiversity. And so there is this brand new CWW beaver restoration program. They've hired 5 permanent staff. They're developing a whole process to do beaver translocation. There's going to be a toolkit that we're working on. There's a beaver management plan that is happening, and we're involved in a technical advisory group to give input on this whole development of a beaver management plan, which there hasn't been a beaver plan, if you will, in California since 1942. So we're excited about that. And then ultimately, just to say that the power in nature-based beaver restoration, as far as I can tell, is equal parts of both art and science. And there's a lot of policy, there's a lot of science here. And then there's also just the emergent relationship of letting beaver be beaver because they're so good at what they do and way better than us at what they do. And I'll just leave you with this final image here of this booklet, which we do have. There's a QR code there. You can download it off our website for free about beaver in California and how we're striving to create a culture of stewardship. And so with that, I thank y'all for listening, and I thank the Beavers for doing their work, and I'll stop sharing and get into some Q&A.
That was awesome. And I love that picture of Jennifer. It's nice. Not just in Sacramento, but she's out in the field too.
Well, she really, yeah, she joined that Build Like a Beaver workshop for a couple of days, and she was like, I'm going to quit lobbying and become a full-time beaver habitat creator. And after the workshop, she was like, I think that's a lot of work, and maybe that's a young person's work.
Yeah, exactly. Well, yeah, so I'll open it up to folks. If you have any questions, I have a couple of my own, but let me hear from others first. Well, maybe I'll kick it off and see if other folks want to jump in. Brock, I'm curious with the funding that you guys were able to secure in 2022. So yeah, like a year and a half ago. I mean, obviously it was a different budget climate then. We did have a surplus, but that's huge to get, I mean, I feel like half the tweets that I see from Wade are about beavers. Like, you really got the administration bought in on this. Any kind of insight or, tips you would share with folks on how that how did that happen? Obviously, Jennifer gets a lot of credit, but what do you think, what kind of messaging was resonating there?
Well, one of Jennifer's great quotes is that she said it's a lobbyist dream to have a client show up and basically have the ball sitting on the rim, and all she had to do was tip it in. So so kind of what the show I showed you is how we did it. We had to take on the mythology of the historic ecology of beaver. We had to take on the benefits. We had to address the salmoniid concerns, the rancher concerns, the mountain meadow concerns. We had to deal with the benefits and the science and the water quality and quantity and recharge and fire stuff. The coexistence strategies of how do you live with them. So it was a full court press. But I would say that as far as really getting the attention of the governor, Wade, Crowfoot, Chuck Bonham, the drought and fire. and endangered species, I would say, especially some of the salmonids and other listed species, where there's a very direct nexus with existential issues that society is facing and is spending a lot of time and money and energy on. And to the degree that there's an organism like beaver, who we are, killing thousands of annually in the state, that could, when partnered with, help with resiliency in some of these. It's not solving everything for us. They're not, like, I hate putting the weight of the world on beaver to cover our ass, to be honest with you, but they're certainly a whole lot more beneficial than not. So I think the whole of the campaign is greater than the sum of any one part, if that's a long-winded way to say it.
Yep. Nope, that totally makes sense. And so, Barbara, I saw your hand, and then I see a question in the chat from Ben. So, Barbara, why don't you go first?
First, I want to ask a question that's not on my list of questions, and that was, my sister used to live in Winters, California, next to Puda Creek, and I remember that there was a big issue with the salmon restoration efforts and the beaver that were living there, and the community trying to save the beaver when CDFW was trying to get rid of them. Do you know what became of that whole boondoggle?
I don't know exactly what ultimately became of it per se, but the experience that I had with it, or the where it was at those folks trying to work on salmonid recovery there, a lot of the work they were doing was primarily focused on riparian revegetation work and trying to increase the shading and some connectivity. And the beavers were cutting down, they're planting all these willows and cottonwoods and all these trees, and then the beavers would come in and cut down their trees. And so people were just pissed at the beaver. And so I think, instead of like saying, oh, that's interesting, how about we plant for the beaver, we do some strategic caging, we do some coexistence structures, because ultimately the beaver and the fish get along. And I think that the department had a general tone back, again, not even within a decade ago, where beavers are just, we've been killing beavers for 70 years. That's how we manage beavers. So we'll just keep killing. It's an adversarial relationship with beaver. And it was very unquestioned in that regard. And I think that those mythologies just promulgate, and that we've had to take that kind of stuff headlong. And so I don't know where the Puda Creek stuff is at right now, but I know that they've been up there a bit more proactive in beaver deterrence. And the beauty of it is once the cottonwoods or willows are established, coppicing, which is what beavers do and what beavers taught humans to do, I think probably from time immemorial, is how those species coexist. But sure, if you've got ginormous canopy closing shade, covering woody trees, then put a fence around them. It's not that complicated.
So, Ben, I see your question in the chat. I don't know if you want to speak to it, or I can read it out loud if you prefer.
Yeah, if I'm getting decent reception.
You're breaking up a little. How about I read it? Yeah, you're breaking up a little.
I live off grid, so I may not be getting good reception.
No, this is better now. Go for it.
Okay. Yeah. So I live on the edge of Six Rivers National Forest at the headwaters of the Smith and Myrtle Creek, and we have a lot of Port Orford cedar blight related die-off. It seems to me in the lower or the upper channel where the stream becomes starts to become perennial with some spring-fed pools and whatnot, and it just seems like the one thing lacking for beaver habitat there would be, year-round water, which they can help with, but also just a lack of deciduous trees. So it seems like planting or encouraging alder, cottonwood, willow is probably part of a restoration of potential beaver habitat, or at least. But I guess, do you have any insights on that, where you have a lot of Port Orford cedar blight?
Yeah,
affecting those upper headwaters.
well, I'm sorry to hear about the Port Orford cedar blight. That's what a wonderful tree that's so limited. So, if are there beavers in the region or within that watershed somewhere downstream or upstream already, or is it beaverless?
Well, I believe they're, yeah, actually, I have seen them up into Myrtle Creek, which is a tributary of the Smith that comes in around the town of Hyuchi. And and I actually have seen beaver activity there. There's a old historic mining like sluice that I imagine is not helping with that's kept intact partially for its, I guess, historic educational value on that Myrtle Creek Trail downstream of us. So yeah, I think it was certainly historic beaver habitat. And I would be surprised if there weren't beavers in the lower system, but I haven't seen any chewing or anything indicative of that in my property or any of my neighbors, a couple properties downstream.
Well, I would say, I mean, just as general, like what beavers need, and you mentioned before, is perennial water, and not just perennial water, but they need enough depth to primarily to avoid predators. Lots of things love to eat beaver. Mountain lions are beaver specialists. And so the impoundment of that pond, it be in a system, and either having their lodge, whether it's a stick lodge out in the middle of the pond, if you will, or it's a bank burrow that, in both cases, the entrance to the burrow or the lodge is underwater, is all about predator avoidance and such. And so, yeah, perennial water, deep water, capacity to avoid predators. And then what you got to was the food question. And beavers absolutely, focus on the inner bark of our softwood trees, the cottonwoods, the willows, alders, those things. But they also love cattail roots, bulrush roots. They love a good salad. They eat greens in the spring. So they have a good diverse diet there. So it could be that part of your strategy would be just to, as the conifers die off, or your existing other conifers, maybe Doug firs or things that are fire laddered and limbing and thinning, needing work that you're talking about there, some of that kind of stuff, utilizing that material for process-based restoration, increase the wetted width, slow the erosion, sequester that carbon in place. Then you could start planting out, sprigging in, if it was appropriate, willow or other deciduous, trees like that. Just a general riparian restoration kind of a project. Whether the beavers end up finding their way there and moving in or not is, you could put beaver lure. You can go on the trapper sites and buy beaver lure, which is castoreum from the gland, which is what and people sometimes have tried to spread that around in the water and like attract beavers. I don't know if it's really successful, but you could try that.
That's interesting. Yeah, that sounds like well, I have been planting a lot of those plants around the pond that was built artificially by the prior owner. Yeah, it seems like all this would be beneficial for fire safety as well. Just having a healthy watershed downhill of a small off-grid community would be a huge part of a larger plan for this area. So, but yeah, I had not thought about that enticement though. That's so, and a couple of those species I actually hadn't thought of that I didn't know were particularly good for them. So thank you. And thanks for all your work. I really appreciate it.
Sure.
So I see Vicky's question in the chat. This is a great one, really relevant to all the work that we're doing. But she notes that it sounds like the work that beavers do are really helping biodiversity efforts, and it's a big part of the state's 30 by 30 program. Is the beaver restoration being touted in that context, as part of 30 by 30? Could we be doing more to elevate that?
It is by me today, so that now you guys are it. Go forth and beaver prosper. I would love for you all that are much more explicitly engaged directly with the 30 by 30 efforts and at the regional level to, as appropriate and as it is authentic, which is the new Merriam-Webster word for the year. I just want to say authentic. That was the chosen
Ironic.
word. By all means, tout beaver as a partner, as a supporter of the 30 by 30 goals where appropriate.
The reason I asked that question in a way is I'm active in the Sierra Club's California 30 by 30 task force, and I feel that everybody probably in the whole state knows a little bit about beavers, whether they've got the facts wrong or not, but beavers are known by the public, whereas the 30 by 30 program is not well known by the general public. And I thought maybe beavers could be used as a bit of a PR agent to publicize the 30 by 30 program more.
Sure, let's just beavers can carry that load too. Put 30 by 30 on them. They'll bring it on. Why not? I would say, not, and being a little bit serious, Kate and I, in other talks we've done, have invoked 30 by 30 nature-based solutions, the climate smart, those types of programs where, so we are, attempt to narrate that language in as a component of the talks we do, for sure.
That's awesome. Great. Any other questions? Barbara, I don't know if you had more on your, yeah, go for it. You might have a longer list. Please jump back in.
There were a couple things you mentioned, Brock. One was the use of beaver for meadow restoration and incised channels. That's an issue in the Southern Sierra, probably many places. And it's mostly caused by cattle grazing, overgrazing of the meadows. But then in your talk, you talked about how beaver could be used to enhance habitat for cattle, which seems a little bit contradictory. So could you talk about how, like with mountain meadows particularly, they could coexist, and what you would need to do in order to make it work?
Yeah, our beavers and bovines buddies or not. And as with all such complicated things, I'll start off with the classic admonition of it depends. And so I think one of the things that with mountain meadows throughout the Sierra, and really trying to look at those meadows which we think historically had beaver at time of contact, when Jed Smith and Walker and Carson and all, all those characters showed up, and they trapped out the Sierra, both sides of the Sierra, really fast. They show up in 1827, 28, and by 1840, 1850, we're pretty much done. Like the whole shebang is done, like a decade or 15 years. So literally what we do have, and I would refer you back to one of the papers I referenced there from Red Clover Meadow, which is up in the Feather River system, North Fork Feather, where they were trying to restore a very deeply incised mountain meadow, like 10, 12 feet deep. And in the process of looking at that exposed bank, one of the folks, Chuck James, saw these sticks sticking out of the bank, and he started looking at them, and he noticed they had beaver chew marks on them. It turns out there was a legacy buried beaver dam. And so he carbon dated that thing. And the bottom of the dam carbon date. So he took a sample at the bottom, at the middle, and at the top. And he sent those three in for C14 data. And the bottom, how old do you think? So here's the other piece to add this puzzle. Joseph Grinnell, back in the 1930s, and Donald Tappy, Division of Wildlife, 1942, assert that beaver were not native to either side of the Sierras or the western slope above 1,000 feet. So there's no beavers supposedly by them, according to them, above 1,000 feet, because it's too cold up there, and there's no food, even though they're called Castor canadensis, which I think is a country up north of us. That's kind of cold. But okay. So what they found is that the bottom of the beaver dam dated to 580 AD, right? The middle of the dam is 1740. The top of the dam is 1850, when the beaver were trapped out, and that beaver wetland ceased being a beaver wetland, and then it begins to unravel. This is before grazing happens. So the dehydration incision of our mountain meadows starts with de-beavering and genocide of indigenous peoples, and then it gets accelerated with grazing. And to be honest with you, sheep is really who the sheep really got worked over in the mountain meadows early on. This is mid 1800s, and then ongoing continuous grazing on public lands of cattle is and sheep. So reversing that effort right now is so back to grazing is just a question of, I think, cows in and of themselves as grazers aren't intrinsically evil, but the management, the time and duration, the time, frequency, and intensity of the presence of the animals, how many animals, at what time of year, how hard they're able to hit things, and can you manage grazing? And what happened in Nevada is that those were on ranch lands where those grazers were actively participating with their herds in moving those animals and selectively removing them in the hot season and being able to manage them. I think what we witness in general, and I don't want to throw all public grazing under the bus here, but continuous grazing where animals are cut loose at a certain time of the year and they're picked up later, and there isn't a lot of active management to minimize or reduce that. So I'll just leave it at that. I think that the opportunity to have working landscapes in rangelands with beaver, there are many case studies where it's working really well, and there's probably more case studies where it's beaverless and incised and overcowed. So
that's really interesting to hear that. And I live in Tulare County. You've been down here. You've looked at what our landscape looks like. Some of those issues that you were talking about, like the lack of water depth, are an issue in our neck of the woods. But you were also saying that we had beaver here historically. So how do you get from a degraded landscape that doesn't support beaver because the conditions are not right to a place where a beaver can safely live and perform their function?
that's the multi-million-dollar question, and it's meadow by meadow based on what was the history of the meadow, what were the history of derangements and degradations to the meadow and the current conditions. And I see Ben's piece about roads and logging roads, and I definitely want to bring that up because we then eroded by putting roads in. They don't call it eroded for nothing because it's about roads. Nothing in nature mimics a road is one of the great quotes of Danny Hagen's. Bill Zedike, who Ben is quoting there, is amazing character as well. And so what I think we have to do is we have to underrange hydrologic conditions of the uplands and how they interact with our meadows, which usually means we have to reduce the runoff and the concentration of flow primarily through road ditches and culverts, which are basically hydraulically mining out our meadows. The incision of the meadows dewaters it and has a complete change in vegetation. Yeah. So where we're really looking at it, and the work I showed you that we're doing in Tasman-Cayome, or what I'm doing all over the coastal zone, is limbing and thinning. So the slash from fuel loads. So slash ain't trash, it's a beneficial biomass. And we have to basically connect our fire fears and our water woes and use those fuels into flows by taking the limbing and thinning and organic biomass, which we're doing with Tule River in Eagle Meadow and Eagle Creek, and placing that organic matter strategically like beavers would to begin to increase the roughness and the potential to aggrade material and catch sediment and reaggrade and slow and spread and sink and store and share water slowly and sequester that carbon so that we can then bring back surface water or subsurface water elevations, reestablish wetland vegetation, reestablish riparian vegetation, and maybe if it's ever appropriate at that point in that location, the possibility of then assisted migration by bringing some beavers back. But we need to do a lot of pre-beavering work in these meadows, and they may never become beaverable again, but we can do a hell of a lot of act like bipedal beavers ourselves and do a ton of work. And in my world, there's billions of pounds of organic biomass called slash right now that's being burned up and piled up that should be utilized in our fluvial system to increase flow and carbon sequestration.
That's, I think, a perfect note to kind of wrap that. We're just at 5, and so appreciate, Brock, you taking the time to chat with us. And I would kind of just leave an outstanding invitation that if there's other things that you're doing that we could help be elevating the role of beavers in 30 by 30, our coalition statewide, we have regional groups all across the state. We have the freshwater working group. So we'd love to help amplify, the role of beavers and the importance of freshwater ecosystems in the 30 by 30 work that the state's doing. So send me any ideas you have. I'd be happy to kind of forward that on to the broader network. And I'll just point out in the chat a couple of resources that both Johnny and Ben shared. So thank you guys for that. That's really helpful. And yeah, if there's any lobbying opportunities, things that we could be supporting, please send that my way as well, so we could help support your guys' work.
Perfect.
Thank
Thanks. Yeah.
Great. Thank you all.
Thank you.
All right.
Thank you, Brock.
All right. Bye.
you.
Good night.